This is EVE Online, a massively multiplayer online spaceship game which is probably best known for two things: making headlines about its massive in-game conflicts involving tens of thousands of players, and its incredibly realistic in-game financial system which can make losing a virtual spaceship just as consequential as losing a phone or a car in the real world. Countless magazines and even much more successful YouTube channels have talked about these two factors individually, but where I think they get really interesting is where they merge together. For a game about spaceships set 21,000 years in the future, EVE is surprisingly realistic, and that realism extends to these massive wars in the sense that they are expensive. The in-game currency called ISK has an approximate exchange rate of $6 per billion in-game ISK. Although it must be mentioned that trading this in-game currency directly back and forth for real-life money is actually against the rules of the game, for now at least, and will get you banned. Even still, this shows that in-game assets have a very tangible real-world value on the gray market. So, when you see headlines about trillions of ISK being lost in one of these epic battles, it gives you an idea of just how expensive it can be to wage entire wars in EVE Online. But this all begs a question. Who or what funds these wars? With a price tag of hundreds of thousands of real-world dollars and nothing but virtual space pride in return, it doesn't sound like a very good deal, right? Well, it's time to learn how space money works, and if you enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing for new videos like this one made every week. Okay, so there are three interesting and unique ways that major wars have been funded over the past 2 decades that this game has existed, but let's start with the most basic one. This game is home to a selection of mega corporations that are run entirely by players, similar in many ways to guilds in World of Warcraft, only on a much larger scale. Now, the largest of these corporations effectively run like nation states. They have defined borders, a standing military, taxation, industry, and of course, command structures. These large institutions will inevitably butt heads with other similar entities over resources, territory, or, just for fun. At the end of the day, it is a video game, so the reasons to go to war can simply be to entertain the members of these corporations. Now, what will normally happen is that these individual participants in these wars need to provide their own combat ships, funded out of the money they make in the game themselves. But if these ships are lost in battle, the mega corporations will pay to replace them. They do this because ultimately they will need manpower to win these wars. Ensuring that people aren't too afraid of losing their ships means that their players will keep logging in and YOLOing into these devastating space battles. Now, these ship replacement programs, or SRP, will often be funded by the taxes collected from these corporations during times of relative peace. The industrialists get given a safe and secure piece of territory to conduct their business, and in return, they need to pay a portion of their profits to a central authority, which will then fund a military program to maintain or potentially even expand this protected territory. Effectively, it's exactly the same as what happens with every government ever in the real world. Now, this is fine in theory, but oftentimes these industrial entities don't have the capacity to wage war themselves. In these circumstances, they can call on mercenary entities that do nothing but wage war on other people's behalf for a fee. Again, not overly dissimilar as to what happens from time to time in the real world with military contract corporations like Academy performing a very similar function. Now, so far we've been looking at the relatively minor wars, the ones that might be a big deal to the players of the game and the ship posters on r/Eve, but are not exactly that remarkable to an uninvolved onlooker like you or I. But this all changed around 5 years ago. You see, EVE's economy is so realistic and so diverse that at one point there were virtual casinos in the game. These were founded, funded, and operated entirely by regular players using the in-game currency. Of course, these casinos generated massive profits, just like most of them do in the real world. Now, these in-game profits were great and all, but there really wasn't much that they could do with them on an individual level. That kind of money can buy every spaceship in the game many times over, so they needed something grander to put their money towards. The logical answer was to sell the in-game money for real-world money, whether it was allowed or not. Sure, they risked getting banned from a video game, but the collective total of ISK that these casinos generated was worth millions of dollars. So, that was a risk that a lot of these casino owners were willing to take. This was especially convenient, given that the thousands of transactions that the casinos handled daily were the perfect cover for in-game money laundering. It was almost impossible to distinguish between transactions that were legitimate and those that weren't. Again, very similar to casinos in the real world, which are continually in the news for being centers of money laundering. However, the more honorable casino owners decided to use their space dollars to buy something not available on the public market: influence. 2016 kicked off the so-called casino wars, as the I Want ISK online casino funded a coalition of players to wage war on the single most powerful corporation in the game at the time, which had wronged the casino in a previous business deal. In reality, all of these other player-run organizations were looking for any excuse to go to war in an attempt to bring the Imperium, as it's known, in check. They simply lacked the financial backing to undertake such a significant challenge. But with the casinos writing the checks as a way to prove a point as to what happens when you dishonor a business deal, one of the most devastating wars in the game's history was enabled, which in turn gave us PC Gamer articles about spectacular space battles. And yes, the financing behind it might have been a little less spectacular, but that doesn't mean that it's any less interesting. Now, shortly following this war, the developers of EVE Online decided to put an end to these player-run casinos. Now, they said they had their own reasons, but most players speculate that it was a combination of wanting to cut down on the trade of in-game money for real money, and also as a response to player backlash over these entities having too much power over the game. What this meant was that in 2020, there was a new funding model required. The old belligerents from the casino war were ready to go at it again, only this time a few things were different. For starters, the casinos were no more, which meant that no side would have limitless funding to them. What's more is that 2020 was a year of working from home with no other options for entertainment besides sitting in front of a computer playing video games. This was all shaping up to create potentially the largest conflict in the game's history, a conflict that would also be the most costly. The most crucial battles during this conflict were inevitably going to be decided by who could bring the largest ships in the game to bear: the Titans. These ships are extremely powerful, and were, at least up until recently, extremely rare. But changes in the game in recent years had meant that these industrial powerhouses could produce these once legendary ships as if they're Ford Model Ts. This didn't mean that they were any less expensive, however. It just meant that the powers that be had to bring more of them to keep up with their opposition. The side that had been previously funded by the casinos were happy to fund this war in the traditional way, using the tax money they had collected over the years of peace and prosperity to foot the bill for these battles. But the Imperium had a better idea. They had seen how finance had decided their fate in 2016, and were keen to ensure they were economically dominant going into the war of 2020. So, they once again looked to reality for inspiration. War bonds are often issued by governments during periods of all-out conflict. This is because modern wars are expensive, and raising taxes is often impossible if the entire economy has been dedicated towards the war effort. So, government bonds are issued so that people can invest their money in their own nation's victory. The Imperium did exactly this. They sold off a series of bonds that would pay interest to their own members. This was obviously great for the Imperium itself because it got the much needed capital injection it needed to go off and fight the war, but it was also great for the members of the group as well. Scams and financial fraud are commonplace in EVE, and there is no regulation about taking someone's stuff and never giving it back. In fact, these types of swindles are probably the thing that EVE is third best known for. But while having a totally unregulated financial system is great for cool stories, it's terrible for investing. Because, well, anything you invest can and likely will just be stolen off you, so why bother? These war bonds presented an opportunity for players to invest in an asset that didn't have quite the same risk of being stolen. For clarity, the Imperium would be fully within their rights to turn around and tell these investors to get stuffed, but the hit to their entity's reputation would likely not be worth it, especially if they ever wanted to sell war bonds again to fund future wars. Now, that doesn't mean that these in-game financial instruments are totally without risk. If the Imperium gets destroyed in this ongoing war, well then, these bonds aren't going to get paid. In the real world, credit analysts call this sovereign risk, and it's no less important here as it is in the land of internet spaceships. But for now at least, this war is still ongoing, and it's likely to provide gaming magazines and aspiring YouTube channels alike many more things to talk about, like the fact that this game's financial markets predicted the short squeeze on GameStop. So make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see us make a video on that. And in the meantime, go and watch our video to find out if the World Bank is really an evil empire. Thanks for learning how money works.